The Man with the Yin-Yang Eyes. Season 3. Episode 24. After the gate leading to the underworld was closed, strange noises kept coming from behind me. Immediately turning my head to see what was going on, I discovered that the sounds were coming from the old tree trunk. A strange thing began to happen, but the lush orchid clinging to the stem started to wither. I guess the souls I just freed are the lifeblood of these orchids. When no longer nourished by those souls, these orchids begin to wither. Realizing that soon all the orchids here will wither away, then they won't be of any use. So I ran up to the tree, trying to be as fast as I could, grab a few fresh orchids before it's too late. From what I've seen so far, I realized that these orchids need the vitality of souls to survive. That's why, for them not to wither, I used my blood to nourish them. Sure enough, this worked. As soon as it came into contact with my blood, the orchid petals gradually became fresh again. Along with that, I could also feel my blood being sucked in by the orchids. As I have solved the problem related to flowers, I suddenly remembered Big D. Since then, I have not heard from him. Usually, he would return here as soon as he could deal with the snake, but this time it wasn't like that. Feeling that something was wrong, I rushed into the forest to find Big D. But even though I called hoarsely, there was still no sign of Big D. When I ran to the front of a clearing, I suddenly stopped because of seeing. After the portal to the underworld opened, the spirit controlling the snake was also sucked into that portal. This causes the snake to lose consciousness and lie motionless. Fortunately, now the snake has caught Big D and is trying to swallow him into its stomach. If only I had acted a little slower, everything would have been irreparable. All Big D's big body now only has 2 legs sticking out. With a panicked scream, I rushed over to pull Big D out of the snake's mouth. I was apprehensive at this point because I kept calling out loud, but Big D didn't respond at all. After a long struggle, I finally pulled Big D out of the snake's mouth. There was a lot of mucus on his body right now, with a highly unpleasant smell. His entire face was pale, lifeless. Seeing Big D right now makes me unable to hold back my tears. In my near-desperate efforts, I do everything I can to get Big D to wake up. But no matter what I did, Big D remained motionless, unresponsive. Big D has literally stopped breathing. Suddenly remembering how rescuers used CPR to give first aid to victims, I immediately applied it to Big D. Right now, even the tiniest glimmer of hope must be grasped. Just like that, I kept performing CPR on Big D. I didn't even notice how long I did it. But all seems to have no effect. Now I have to accept that Big D will not be able to wake up again. Just when I was most desperate, Big D's fingers began to move. A few seconds later, Big D's whole body started to shake and move. Unable to hide my joy, I rushed to Big D's side to see how he was. As soon as he opened his eyes and saw me, Big D groaned. "Damn, you were also swallowed by the snake?" After realizing that he was still alive, Big D breathed a sigh of relief and closed his eyes to rest. I waited for him to lie down a little longer and then helped him sit up. After all, danger had passed. Big D started to ask me about the orchids. I immediately raised my arm for Big D to see. While waiting for Big D to recover, I briefly explained to him what I had done, as well as how I keep these flowers from wilting. After taking a break to regain our strength, we set out to find our way back. Without a map to determine where we were, the two of us had to find our way through the forest. Realizing that walking like this is not a good idea, sooner or later we will both get lost. So Big D suggested that we go along the river to return. Realizing that Big D's opinion was entirely correct, the two of us immediately changed direction. The first thing we had to do before we reached the riverbank was to get off the steep cliff we had crossed earlier. After reaching the riverbank, we cut down bamboo trees in the forest to make a raft. Just like that, the two of us controlled the raft to float along the water to reach the village of the wizard. As promised, Leo is always here waiting for us. But when we met again, he didn't seem very happy. I guess he has something to say to us from his attitude but hasn't had the chance yet. This is understandable because Big D has been talking continuously since then, making Leo unable to speak. Gradually Big D also sensed that something was wrong here. People weren't as happy as he imagined. By the time we entered the sorcerer's tent, everything inside made the two of us had startled. In the tent, everything was in disarray. Some things were not even intact. In the center of the tent, the wizard was waiting for us with his bodyguards. The strange thing is that all of them were injured. Unable to hide his surprise, Big D started asking Leo what had happened while the two of us were not there. At this point, Leo hesitated to speak. According to Leo, while we searched for an antidote, two strangers came and stole the lantern. Seemingly unable to believe what he had just heard, Big D jumped up and grabbed Leo's collar and shouted, "What did you just say? How could there be such a coincidence? You're joking, right?" Unexpectedly, Big D was so agitated, Leo stammered and told everything. Accordingly, not long after we started our journey, two strangers came here. They consisted of a blonde and a silver-haired man, both very young, who had stolen the lantern from the sorcerer's hand. Although everything is clear, Big D is constantly screaming in the tent. He even suspects that the wizard colludes with those to take advantage of him. Knowing that this lantern means a lot to Big D, the sorcerer fully sympathizes with his attitude. He kept saying sorry to us. Looking at the injuries of the wizard and his subordinates, I could tell that they fought with all their might but failed to stop the other two. Faced with this situation, I didn't know what to say, so I kept quiet. No matter what the sorcerer said, Big D didn't want to hear it now. He was furious before leaving the wizard's tent. With no other choice, I went in front of the sorcerer and gave him the orchids we had just brought. Looking at the orchids, the sorcerer kept saying thank you most sincerely. I also asked Leo to tell him how to keep these orchids from withering. Then I quietly walked out to find Big D. After going out, I went over to comfort Big D. "Hey, don't be angry anymore. The most important thing is to calm down right now. I think you already guessed who did this, right? Looks like the two of us were pranked by him from the start." Still very angry, but Big D is not the kind of person that doesn't think. He turned around and said to me, "Damn it, I didn't expect to live to this age and let a kid with an unclean nose lead me through. I don't understand what he's doing that for." Like Big D, there are many unanswered questions in my mind right now. But for sure, there will be someone we need to deal with. This time, I will definitely not go easy on him. Hello friends, so it's time for us to say goodbye to each other. Thank you for accompanying me and Big D during the past time. We will have a long and challenging journey ahead of us. We hope to see you again soon. Once again, thank you very much for all the love you have given us. Don't forget us.